Welcome back to our afternoon session. This is a panel titled Threats to Citizenship in a Changing World. We just had a great session for those of you just joining us live with Terry Gerton, the President of the National Academy of Public Administration, Dustin Brown of the Office of Management and Budget, Sean O'Keefe, a Professor of Public Administration and International Affairs at the Maxwell School and a much celebrated public servant, and Governor Whitman, former governor of New Jersey. In this panel, all of the bios are available both online and in the program before you. Jamie Winders is chair and professor of geography, and she'll be both our moderator and timekeeper. She's to my immediate right. Next to Jamie is Elizabeth Cullen, a professor of political science. Next to Elizabeth is the Honorable Steve Haggerty. He's the CEO of Haggerty Consulting, as well as the new mayor of the city of Evanston in Illinois. And next to Steve is Chris Meek. Chris is a senior director of global relationship management at S&P Global, as well as being the CEO and founder of Soldier Strong, a nonprofit organization. In this session, one of the things that we're really going to try to understand is that there are many threats facing citizenship in today's society. And we're going to hear four very different perspectives, four perspectives that I think are not addressed as often as we need them to be. And so before we begin, I just want to, again, thank all the staff for their excellent work in putting this together, as well as our team from the Information and Computing Technology. They've done great work today, filming and live streaming all of this. And thank you so much for being here.
Okay, so thanks for coming out. Ooh, I'm a little overeager. Maybe I'll back off the microphone. Thanks everyone for coming out. As Dave mentioned, this session really focuses on thinking about some of the threats to citizenship in a changing world, what some of those might be, and also how we might start to think and act differently about citizenship in response to those challenges. So we're each going to speak for about 5 to 7 minutes. And then we'll kind of have a dialogue among ourselves, but then what we're really interested in is opening up the floor and hearing your questions. So we took a vote and decided that Elizabeth would go first.
I wasn't here for this vote.
Serves you right.
So Elizabeth,
okay.
Take it away.
By the way, an academic 5 to 7 minutes is actually 9 minutes. Thanks so much for coming, and thanks to my co-panelists for being here. I'm excited about this discussion. I want to talk today about 2 recent pieces of academic work that I think tell us about how individual Americans think about their own public service as manifest in exercises of the office of citizen. The first work is an extended essay by an historian, Mark Lula, and examines how political parties have been attempting to motivate voters to choose in their favor. The second work is a study of voter behavior by 2 political scientists, Christopher Aiken and Larry Bartels. They examine what motivates voters, not just at the ballot box, but all year long. And seen this way, we have 2 different contributions to a picture of how we are thinking about the signature act of citizenship, electoral participation. One looks at individuals, the other looks at institutions, and taken together, we get this complete picture. So last fall, after the final weeks of what was truly an intense presidential campaign, the Columbia historian Mark Lula published an op-ed in the New York Times, caused quite a stir. It later became a book. Lula considers himself a liberal. I think most of us would see him as a quite conservative Democrat. And his argument, very briefly put, is that the Democratic Party needs to turn away from what he calls identity liberalism. Identity liberalism relies on appeals to subgroups, racial minorities, women, foreign-born persons, so on. And Lula thinks that the identity appeals of the Democratic Party advance a kind of competitive individualism that is antithetical to the nature of citizenship because it encourages a focus on difference and trains us off of thinking of ourselves as indivisible parts of a whole. In classical democracy, my political theory moment, in classical democracy, we're intended to think about what is good for us, maybe as a city, right? Not our individual private self-interest, as the Athenian oath exhorts us. Lula seems to be suggesting that the Democratic Party has abandoned Athenian citizenship ideals in favor of narrower interest-based appeals. Okay, so that's one diagnosis of what went wrong with one party. And now I'll broaden the analysis to talk more generally about what all voters are doing in response not just to these appeals, but to all political decisions. And here I'm going to bring in the second work. So little backstory on voter behavior. For the first part of the 20th century, voting was understood as something that citizens undertake on the basis of what they perceive to be their interests, maybe what they perceive to be the values of the parties fielding candidates. That's not a classical view of how democratic citizenship should work, any more than what Lula describes, but in both cases, very narrow interests take precedent over larger visions of the good. But there was at least a logic to the idea that we each use our little piece of the franchise to communicate to representatives exactly what it is we want or need. It was also believed that the end result would be a politics that played to the median voter, and that would moderate our political outcomes, particularly if large numbers of voters were aggregated. That effect could be really powerful. Beginning in the 1950s, however, questions arose as to how accurate this liberal individualist model of citizenship actually was. So first, it appeared that many voters were actually woefully ill-informed about their choices and the likely outcome of those choices. Second, people seem not to be able to hold a consistent view over time. So they react to information they received very recently, more than they'll take into account things they heard a while ago. They forget things that happened, it turns out, more than 6 months ago. And also, they just behave irrationally sometimes. So they weren't doing the thing that they were supposed to be doing. Despite opportunities to deliberate, become informed, express preferences, citizenship as expressed by voters seemed somewhat incoherent. And this might have been okay if we had a system of trusteeship in which representatives are just supposed to take care of us after we elect them. But we don't have a system of trusteeship. We actually expect our representatives to do what we tell them to do. We're not supposed to hand off our responsibilities in that way. So de Tocqueville said, okay, well, we may have a delegate system, but we have mediating institutions like political parties and the press to filter and organize information. And he wasn't entirely wrong. We do have them. And what we learn from now recent studies of how people make decisions when they vote is that they often react emotionally rather than rationally. We've seen some evidence of that recently. And they kind of want to go with their gut. And furthermore, their feelings are often not shaped by principles or standards. Their feelings are determined by their own understanding of, now we're back to the big word, identity. So identity in politics is complicated because politics is competitive. And if we're voting based on our identity, it means every time we have a political competition, we're pitting our identities against each other. And that's dangerous terrain because when people's identities are involved in competition, they often respond in, shall we say, unproductive ways. So here's where things get just a little more interesting. It turns out that the identity that we often refer to in politics is not the same identity we might use when we're meeting people face to face. It's not even the same identity Lula was criticizing. In politics, our identity is often our political party. That sounds logical, but I'll show that it leads to some kind of illogical things or things we wouldn't expect. It's so powerful, this identity, that people often come to adopt positions and preferences based on their party affiliation. So instead of, for example, deciding, I'm for deficit-conscious policies, so I will vote Republican. Oh wait, Republicans we elected are no longer deficit-conscious, so I am not a Republican. Instead of doing that, right, this is what happens. People say, I'm a Republican. Republicans are for deficit-conscious policies. Therefore, I must be for deficit-conscious policies. Oh wait, Republicans we elected are no longer for deficit-conscious policies. I am a Republican, so I am no longer for deficit-conscious policies, right? The principle has left the picture there. From the perspective of citizenship, identity-based politics are therefore problematic, not because they're overly individualistic, but because they get us to abandon our principles in favor of emotional attachments. We actually need to be able to form opinions, or at least trust our parties to give us good information. If a deficit-conscious voter joins the Republican Party, that voter or that party owes that voter either fealty to the principle or a very persuasive explanation about why things have changed. So here we are. We want to talk about how to put together realistic expectations of citizenship with realistic expectations of our institutions. Lula says we need a broader appeal, but this other political science research tells us that the big broad appeal we have to political party isn't really getting us to behave as principled actors. Plus, it's just not going very well, right? Like, nobody's very happy with where politics are right now. In either case, identity is a problem. And so I just want to kind of conclude by thinking about, like, what can we realistically ask for? I don't think we can realistically expect to retrain citizen brains to learn to process information differently. People aren't going to shed emotions. They're not going to magically have longer memories or start to understand tax policy better. But I do keep wondering if linkage of identity and competitive elections has to mean that we're at war with one another. And now we're on a college campus, and I've brought up identity. And this is a pretty loaded term, not just on campuses, but many places in society today. I don't know that it should be quite as loaded as it is. We all have an identity. Our identities are complicated. They're made of some very broad traits, like Lula's describing, and some that aren't universalizable, that we're extremely attached to. It's a very basic human need to feel that your identity is coherent and recognized by others as such. If you think this isn't true of yourself, then what's happened is the need has been met so well that you simply haven't perceived it yet. So we all want our identity to receive respect, and when it does, we're better off for that fact. And it's also really satisfying and cathartic to offer respect to another person whose identity is foreign and unfamiliar. When we do so, we share common ground. We feel good about ourselves for behaving in a way that we know is worthy of respect, and we feel good when we receive respect in return. We are, in that one moment, I think, equals, and equality is a necessary, if not sufficient, condition for democratic citizenship. Just one more thing I'll say. As bad a rap as campuses get these days, I think the day-to-day life on campus is a really good laboratory for how to do this. If you ignore what you hear about what goes on and look at what's really happening, we're doing this on a day-to-day basis. So I think this is a really good training ground for some of the things we want people to be doing in politics.
Now we'll turn to Steve.
Okay, all right. Well, all this talk about identity brings back lots of thoughts, because I am a new mayor of Evanston, Illinois, which is one of the greatest urban ring cities in America. Incredibly diverse community, socioeconomically, racially, ethnically. We have billionaires that live in Evanston. We have 40% of the kids that go to our schools that are on free or reduced lunch. And I've been here for 4 months in this office. I went through a 7-month campaign for this part-time $25,000 a year job. I won't tell you how much I spent on it, but all of Elizabeth's talk about identity, has me thinking to tell my remarks this way. So I will. I'm Steve Haggerty. If at the end of this you like something that I say or you don't like something I say, I'm going to help you remember who the heck I am, because we walk away from these things and we can never remember, okay, what was that person's name? So several years ago, I was with my nephew, and we were in the backyard, and he lives in Kansas City, and he was about 10 years old or so at the time, and there was this other kid from the neighborhood who was about 9, who came over, and we ended up throwing the football around in the backyard. And about 15 minutes into throwing the football, the kid looks at me and goes, "Hey," he goes, "your name's Steve and my name's Steve." I said, "Hey, how about that?" I said, "Is yours spelled with a V or a PH?" And the kid looked at me kind of funny and said, "Mine's spelled with an S." So my name is Stephen Haggerty. It is spelled with an S and a PH. I grew up on a small farm in a working-class town called Attleboro, Massachusetts, right near Norton, where Governor Todd Whitman went to college. My parents were middle school teachers. We didn't have that much money. We would never go out to eat. We had, 2 Ford Pintos, and it was a great experience to grow up there. I went to the best college that I could get into, which is right here at Syracuse University, one of the few that would admit me. Thank you, Syracuse. And I wanted to go into the public sector, right? Like a lot of people in this room, I applied for all these jobs. Some of which I was qualified for at the state and the local level, and I didn't get any of them. And I ended up getting a job for Price Waterhouse in their Office of Government Services. I had no idea what management consulting was, but I liked the idea it was government, and I knew I wanted to work in government. And I developed an expertise at a younger age in the federal disaster program. And after 8 years at Pricewaterhouse, I left and I went on my own to start Haggerty Consulting. I didn't know what Haggerty Consulting would be. I was just an independent consultant. Haggerty Consulting grew over the years from when I started it to being one of the niche firms around the country that helps communities prepare for and recover from disasters. The current administrator for the Federal Emergency Management Agency was our executive vice president just 3 months ago, a guy named Brock Long, who's getting fairly good reviews, and was bipartisan support, 95-4, confirmed by the Senate. I have found the work that I have done incredibly, incredibly rewarding. We get the opportunity, and the federal government gets the opportunity and has made it a value to help people when they really need the help of the government. As my company grew and as I got more and more involved in my own community and a lot of nonprofits in my community, with the Chamber of Commerce in my community, I think I've always thought a lot about citizenship and being a good community member and how you become involved. And recently, after a dinner that we actually had here 3 years ago in the Founders Room at Maxwell, I sat there and I listened to two former very senior state legislators with the last name Barkley and Lombardi speak about how the legislative bodies and the executive branch are not the same as they used to be. Compromise is a bad thing. And they bemoaned the state that we're in right now. A couple, maybe 5 minutes later, Dean Steinberg said to the group, and there were about 20 of us having dinner, he said, "Why is it that more of our graduates of the Maxwell School are not going into elected office?" And I raised my hand as one of the younger people on the board, and I said, well, the younger people have eyes and ears, and they see the dysfunction, and they think, my gosh, why would I put myself into that arena? I care about this country. I care about my community. How else can I contribute? And they think about all the different ways. I think about citizenship in a really broad context. But I left that meeting 3 years ago, and I thought to myself, my gosh, I have had a wonderful life experience from growing up in a blue-collar town to parents who are school teachers to starting a company and to growing that company. I can run for mayor, I could put myself in that arena, and so I decided to do that. The reason I mentioned that whole story is because I want to talk about identity politics for 1 second when we talk about threats to citizenship, okay? So you've heard real quickly sort of my story. So we had a primary in the race that I ran for. There were 5 people in the primary. I almost won the election outright in the primary, and I was running against 2 sitting aldermen, a former township supervisor, and a person who perennially runs for office locally. And I got 44% of the vote. 6 more points, and I would have won the election. I then was in a runoff with 2-term aldermen, and in that runoff, it became a race of identity politics. So I decided, and one of the reasons I ran is I think we need more civility. I think we need more respect. I don't think we need to be running campaigns like we do, and I don't know how you really break this, but running campaigns like we do, where if you don't know, the worst crook, the worst criminal in the entire world is Hillary Clinton. Because if I tell you enough times, crooked Hillary, you start to question, my gosh, this is a person that lacks ethics. And so I decided I wasn't going to run that campaign. I decided I was going to run a campaign that says, hi, I'm Steve Haggerty. I grew up on a small farm. My parents are school teachers. I want you to know where I came from. And here's my thoughts on governing, okay? I think that people need to be informed by the government. People need to be heard. People need to know there's an open and an honest process. And people need government to make a decision. And here's my thoughts on a few of the issues. In the general campaign, when it's just I running against another person, that's the story I told. I never said anything about my opponent. I liked my opponent. I always said, if I don't become mayor, I think he should be the mayor of Evanston. Their campaign was, yeah, hi, I'm so-and-so. But let me tell you about Steve Haggerty. Steve Haggerty is a wealthy man. We have a wealthy man in Washington, D.C., who's the president of this country. We have a wealthy man in Springfield, Illinois, who's the governor of Illinois, a gentleman named Bruce Rauner. We don't need wealthy people coming into our community and running Evanston. That is not how we do things here. And by the way, Steve Haggerty says he cares about Evanston, that he's involved in all these nonprofits and everything else. Steve Haggerty doesn't even send his kids to school here in Evanston. So, in the general election, people thought, oh, based on the primary, oh, Steve's going to, run away with this because I got 44%. I won the election by 115 votes at the end of the day. And that and you never know. I will tell you, you never know why you win or you lose an election. I think there's way too many variables in this. But at the end of the day, when you look at the voting patterns and everything else in our community, to that part of our community that didn't know either I or my opponent, that story resonated. I lost that entire part of the community. The other part of the community that knew both of us and happened to be sort of a more affluent part of the community, I ended up winning. So threats to citizenship, I'm just going to wrap it up with some, and then we can talk about this as we go through. I do think, getting wrapped up in identity politics, okay, is a real threat. We have become so smart at human psychology and how to manipulate people, whether it's for commercial interests or potentially elected interests. I think social media has now created a platform for everyone to think that they can shout as loud as they do. I also think we have people that are feeling left behind in this country, okay, and are very frustrated on the far right. And then I think we have people on the far left who also feel very, very frustrated that people aren't listening to me. And when you feel that people aren't listening to you, what do? You start to raise your voice and you start to scream and you start to say, listen, I don't have a job because they're all going to, some other country, or because they're going to Immigrants. And that's what you start to do. And you see that both in, I think public meetings, and I attend a lot of public meetings now, as well as social media. And then lastly, I would just say, I'm very, very concerned about the threat to citizenship by alternative facts. If we as communities and as a country can't agree on what the facts are, God save us. I mean, I really, really worry about that. So I'll leave it at that for just real quickly a list of threats that I see, and I look forward to this conversation with this esteemed panel up here.
Excellent. Thank you, Steve. So, Chris.
Good afternoon. My name is Chris Meek, and I'm a Republican, so therefore I no longer believe in deficit-reducing policies. Is that the line? Feels good to say that. I think I'm the token private sector guy. I have a very random and varied background. Again, a graduate of this esteemed university, a year behind Steve, so I'm a year younger. He looks younger, though. I spent 25 years in the financial services industry. The last 7 or 8, I've also founded and run a veteran-focused nonprofit. Left financial services to run for Congress. Didn't win, so I had to get a day job and go back to financial services. And oddly enough, I'm actually now in I just finished my first term of the Maxwell's Executive MPA program. So 25 years later, back on campus, virtually. There's a few classmates here, so good to see you guys here. I think in terms of the threats to citizenship, 2 of the daily conversations on the news that overlap are the widening gap in economic inequality, as well as economic competitiveness of this nation. And I think the 2 overlap. I do think there's a widening of the gap. Steve talked about the elections and raising your voice. And I see the 2016 presidential election as a referendum on that gap. You had an entire socioeconomic class that says, I've been left behind the last 8 years, I'm going to be heard. And they were heard. And so obviously, we're still trying to figure out what's going to happen next. There's obviously a lot of dysfunction going on, and that is a big fear. It's always a fear, but I think more than ever, that's a fear out there. But I believe that economic competitiveness is something that leads to financial security. And that's something that we need to focus on here as a country. I stated my political beliefs earlier, but economic competitiveness, I think, is not driven out of Washington. We need things, it's actually impeded by Washington. We need to have tax reform. We need to have regulatory reform. things need to be streamlined. We have to have actual facts so we know what we're streamlining and what we're reforming. I think the biggest takeaway from my first class I just finished, and actually Professor Nabachi, who was here earlier today, she was my professor. The biggest takeaway from that class I got, and it was on democracy and public administration, was her favorite phrase was, "It depends." And it's a great way to kind of get out of what the real answer is, but it does depend. We need government, but we also need the private sector to drive competition, to drive financial security. Now, should government be run like a business? I wrote a paper defending that. But in times of crisis, Steve's business does it. Unfortunately, we've seen it recently with the tragic hurricanes down south. The first thing people do is they turn to their government. They look to their government for help. And so there is a place for both at the table. It needs to be a 50-50 place. But someone always seems to be tweeting or grabbing social media and trying to have their voice louder than the other one. So I guess overall, in terms of threats to citizenship, we do need both parties, but it's always going to, it depends.
Excellent. Thank you, Chris. So my name's Jamie Winders, and I'm going to try to hold myself to the same time that I held other people to. I'm the chair of the geography department. I just want to thank the deans for the invitation to be part of this panel. I think some of the other panelists read my notes before they spoke, so we're going to have some repeating, but I think that's important because it sort of starts to identify some of these key threats. Most of my work focuses on immigration, and especially the politics of immigration and the politics of immigrant settlement, and citizenship, and debates about citizenship really sit at the center. So I just want to make sort of 3 quick observations about the effects of changing public opinions and also policies vis-a-vis immigration. And the first builds on what Elizabeth mentioned briefly, the idea that we behave irrationally as beings, and we often see this in immigrant reception. And public policies and public opinion about immigration are rarely static. They change very quickly. Anti-immigrant sentiment has been kind of a constant throughout U.S. history and American social and political life, but so has change. So if we look at I do a lot of research in the context of the American South, and if you look at the 10-year period from 2002 to 2012, when I started studying that region and the politics of immigrant settlement there, I was talking about a new form of Southern hospitality. By 2005, we started to see very strong anti-immigrant state and local policy. So within a few years, there was this huge sea change. In 2012, a lot of southern states were sort of at the leading edge of very restrictive policies. Most of those got held up in the courts. By the next year, there was sort of a sense of acceptance. So in a 10-year period, we see these massive sea changes in public opinion. If we think about this at the national scale, it's kind of hard to remember, but right after the 2012 election, a lot of conservative pundits publicly said they'd had a change of heart around immigration. In early 2013, there was hope for comprehensive immigration reform. That hope had diminished by fall 2013. Summer 2014 saw the arrival of unaccompanied minors from Central America that changed the tone again. But the overall numbers coming across the southern border were dropping. Trump enters the race in 2015, making immigration a huge issue again. And now we're in a context with very restrictive executive orders. So in a 5-year period, we've gone from sea changes in political attitudes toward immigration to the possibility of comprehensive immigration reform to very restrictive executive orders. The second thing I would say, and this really echoes what Chris and Steve mentioned, is that public opinion on immigration is often a proxy for a lot of other things. And so one of those is that immigration is both the thing that defines and that challenges American identity, right? So one of the stories we tell about ourselves is that we're a nation of immigrants. But one of the other things we're also very concerned about are, quote, hyphenated Americans, right? So we're a nation of immigrants, but we have concerns about people who identify as Mexican American or Japanese American. And so conversations about immigration are always conversations about who we think we are as a people. Conversations about immigration are also always about race. Even when it's talked about in the language of cultural difference, race has always been a central factor in how we think about immigration. And then finally, again, as Steve and Chris really pointed out, in the contemporary moment, immigration has come to proxy for that feeling of being left behind that we often see associated, especially with white working class communities, in the context of kind of investment in the idea of American individualism, it's very difficult to say I lost my job because of outsourcing and automation and a global race to the bottom in wages, but it's very easy to say I lost my job because of immigrants, right? Because the first explanation is really complicated. The second explanation has a really simple solution. If the problem is immigrants, the solution is restrictive immigration policy. And so that's something we've really seen as sort of immigration becoming this proxy for that overall feeling of being left behind. So I'll end by talking a little bit about the third point, which are what are the effects of kind of anti-immigrant public sentiment, or what we might describe as relatively harsh immigration politics or policies. And I'm going to steal from Tina and say it depends. So on the one hand, the kind of situation that we see now can really kind of catalyze immigrant politics and activism. And so we saw this advocacy around DACA, the Deferred Action Childhood Arrivals, in 2012 and 13 leading up to it, and we've certainly seen it in response to Trump's decision to end it. If we think back to 2006 and A Day Without Immigrants, a lot of the protests that we saw. But at the same time, the kind of anti-immigrant sentiment we're seeing can also really send immigrant communities underground. And this is something that we saw in the late 2000s in Arizona and in Georgia and in Alabama and a lot of states. It's certainly something we're seeing now in sort of recent response to increased ICE raids, to the executive orders. In this sense, when communities go underground, they have profound effects not only on urban government, on practices of citizenship, on all the things that we're collectively invested in. You know, when immigrants withdraw from the public sphere, from public participation, from public service, and from kind of the public itself, when they have fear of interacting with police or officials, when they're too scared to be involved in their local schools, that has real-world consequences that don't only affect the now, but we know that some of these dynamics have intergenerational effects. So you can see the effects of these dynamics 2 generations out. So of course there are these long-term policy consequences for communities that feel they can't be part of public life at the local or the national level. Now, there's a silver lining, but it's also kind of a double-edged sword. So we know from past social movements that children who watch their parents face oppression or discrimination are often galvanized to act as adults. And so we can think about the civil rights movement and the things that motivated leaders there. So I think there's a lot of political possibility and hope from the children of immigrants. At the same time, there's a real risk, right? So when children born in places like the US, and we've certainly seen this across Europe, see no way that they can find a sense of belonging or be part of the national fold or be part of national communities, they always feel they're excluded, that they don't belong, where will they turn to find that sense of belonging? And this isn't just an issue in relation to immigration. If we think globally, there are about 66 million people who are forcibly displaced from their homes. Half of them are children, right? So that's a profound number of children who are growing up without a sense of place that they can belong to. And again, that we don't always think about that in terms of policies, but those kids are going to grow up, you know, and there's a question about kind of what will their futures be. So I'm going to stop there, and I thought this runs until 3:30, right? So we could talk a little bit, try to find, we already see quite a few points of connection. You guys collectively identified some key threats around identity and identity politics. Steve talked about those communities in need, both immediate needs of sort of disaster situations, but also long-term needs. Steve and Chris both talked about the issue of inequalities and the impacts of inequalities, the issue of alternative facts, and then kind of this widening gap. So I guess maybe we just throw ourselves into the deep end and we think about, so in our corners of the world, so we have expertise in sort of finance and urban government, nonprofits, academia. What would it take to think about ways to overcome some of these challenges? And since I asked the question, I came up with a question, so you guys have to do all the answering.
4 of us locked in the room for a couple hours?
I'm happy to start us off, because I think about this a lot, right? How do we, get people engaged? And during the campaign, people would say to me, Steve, we need to figure out a way to get more people to the city council meetings, okay? Because we get, I don't know, we can get 100 to 300 people depending on the issues. So we need to figure out how to get more people to city council meetings. And the entire time I always said, no, we need to figure out how to bring government to the people. Like, I really feel strongly that it can't be that, government is on government's timetable that you come to us. And so at least, thinking about things that way, what I'm trying to do is say, okay, how do we bring government to the people? Like, let's go to, the community centers or the churches where people are. We started this thing as soon as I became mayor called the Haggerty Huddle. And the Haggerty Huddle is this thing that we do around town, and we do it under the banner of civic, okay? So civic bites, civic beer, civic custard we have coming up. If you want to come to Evanston, that's with a lot of sort of Northwestern students and millennials. So just add something to civic, and that's sort of it. And it's sort of this Haggerty Huddle, and that's what we do. So I'm thinking a lot about, again, how do we get sort of government out there to the people. So I'll leave it at that, and I have some other ideas, but we can talk later.
I agree with Steve's point, but I also think more than ever, we need to be engaged ourselves. We need to bring ourselves to the government. When I ran for Congress, everyone has their label, right? Either there's an R or a D after your name. And they kept trying to label me, like Steve went through that as well. And I said, listen, and this is during the financial crisis or just after. I said, we're a country right now. No one has an R or D after their name. They have an A, because we're all Americans. And more than ever, we need to come together for that sense. And I got engaged because, financial services industry, I saw the crisis from the front row. And there were a couple days, honestly, where I thought that was it, game over. And at the time, obviously, a lot of folks were losing their home to foreclosure. And we were out one night having a couple beers to blow off some steam. And I said, why is it so hard? Why can't we get the banks and the homeowners in the same room together, let them figure it out? And someone said, Chris, that's a great idea. You should go for it. And actually put something together. So I literally took a list of all the banks where I live in Connecticut and started calling them. And I wasn't sure when I called them to say my name is Chris Meek with insert bank I worked for at the time here, or Chris Meek from Stamford, Connecticut, not knowing what the response would be. Long story short, I had a one-day program where I live at the community center. We had about 6 or 8 banks, a few national, a few regional. And that day, 36 families walked out with their loans modified and didn't lose their home. So I thought, okay, great, mission accomplished, check the box. So that was on a Saturday. The next day, Sunday newspaper, above the fold, was the article, actually. And on Monday, the reporter who covered the story, she called me and said, Chris, when's your next event? And I said, Elizabeth, what the hell are you talking about? This is a one-shot deal. And she said, well, I've gotten about 200 phone calls looking for this. So I saw the need, found a short-term solution. Long story short, ended up having 11 programs throughout the state of Connecticut over the next 12 to 14 months. About the 6th or 8th program, the governor of Connecticut started having the Department of Banking start attending our events. And all of a sudden, the governor announces that he's going to start doing a foreclosure event where he brings banks and homeowners together. So again, check the box. He took that over. I guess my long-winded answer here is that we need more engagement by individuals and households. I'm a father of 3, a taxpayer, a homeowner. And I was looking to use my, I'll call it expertise, for lack of a better word, to find a solution to help those who couldn't.
Can I just add to what you said? I would argue that, there's a difference between initiative and engagement. And what you just described, Chris, was about initiative. You seeing a problem and you stepping up and showing leadership. And the only reason I say that is because I listen to you to talk about that, and I think about the folks that come to our city hall or city council meetings. I had a person during the campaign that said to me, Steve, I think I like you, but how am I going to know if you're really representing the majority? I said, wow. I said, that's a good question. So what is the majority? If you're saying that the majority of people that come to a city council meeting and advocate for one position, is the majority, then I don't think that's the case. I think that's why we have elections. And I think that the people that we elect need to properly balance a bunch of different values, sometimes competing, that we have as a community. And so I think that also creates a level of rising frustration with people, because these are folks who are active and they show up at the city council meeting and they say, mayor and city council, you need to fill in the blank. You need to gift the mansion that we have that's by the lake to this, nonprofit here in the community. And 50 of them get up there and say that, and ultimately city council says, yeah, we're not going to do that. That doesn't seem like good government. If we're going to have somebody have it, we'll do an RFP process for it. And that leaves them with a bad taste in their mouth. You told us to get involved in government. We showed up. We're here. We're telling you. And now you're not doing what we say. And that happens a lot with people that are really active.
So there's an interesting kind of similarity in what you two are talking about of sort of creating these spaces or opportunities for engagement between the banks and homeowners, or taking government out into different spaces within the community. But if we turn to the kind of very sharp identity politics that Elizabeth has been talking about, I mean, is that a model that we could say, okay, to use the Republicans and the Democrats, Trump and non-Trump supporters, let's put you in a room together and see if you can work this out?
Didn't Oprah just try to do that?
It's called WWE, I think.
Or is there something different about the kinds of identity politics that we're seeing now that just creating that space for engagement isn't enough?
Well, I think there's two things that, oh, sorry. Is this still on? Yes.
You have to lean in.
But not too much. Just the right amount. It's encouraging posture. So two things that I pull out of your comments, Chris and Steve, is that we need more face-to-face interaction. Both of you were describing instances in which we pull from a larger group of people, a smaller group, to actually be together. And together in ways that aren't necessarily about large confrontations. They take defined issues and try and solve problems one by one. Face-to-face democracy is really the only kind there was ever supposed to be. So it makes sense that we think that is a really successful model. But I think, there's a couple things that happen when you do democracy face-to-face. When you're face-to-face, you have to take responsibility in a way that we don't when things scale up, right? It's easy to not take responsibility. It's also the case that when we're face-to-face, we know each other, and when we know each other, then not only do we understand each other's identities, but we tend not to dislike each other in the ways we can when we're abstract, distant, when we project imagined selves onto actual people. So one of the things that I think we've heard after the election over and over again is like people saying, I really supported Trump and I definitely wanted him to build the wall and deport people, but I didn't think that was going to mean like my neighbor. My neighbor is a good person, not, and you realize people have these imaginary enemies that they wouldn't be able to have if we were doing face-to-face democracy and taking responsibility. One last comment, either of those things, any of these things, either way you described it, they both require leadership. And that's, for me, that's like kicking the can into somebody else's sandbox, because I don't study leadership and I don't know enough about it, but I just keep thinking over and over again lately, like, what does it take? When they say like great leaders are born in great moments, we're in the moment. We need leaders to do these things. And we thank you for being one.
So I had a question for Chris. So I'm going to show my ignorance here, but when I think about financial services and sort of the financial realm, I think of that as being something that really works on a global scale, kind of in a contemporary moment. So when you think about the work that you're doing, how or why is the idea of citizenship central to that, if you're in a realm that really is kind of these global flows?
I think more than ever, we are all global citizens. Mm-hmm. Obviously, email and social media has been able to allow us to connect within nanoseconds around the world. And it doesn't matter where you are, everyone's facing the same problems right now. Economic inequality, education, healthcare, whatever it is, they're all the same problems. Everyone's got different leaders, different ways of trying to solve it. No one's got the secret sauce or the right answer, because there are different answers and methodologies for each of those, and certainly in each region. But for us to be that global citizen, we have to understand that we are all facing this together, whatever it is. We did go through that again during the crisis about 7-8 years ago. We haven't come out any stronger from it. We have more regulations, more taxes, more disconnect, more anger at the UN, and those are real problems. And so I guess maybe to your point in terms of leaders being born, to your point, I mean, this is the moment. We need people to step up. A lot of people stepped up for the last election on one side, but then sort of the, thumb your nose at Washington candidate came in, and that was the real referendum, rightly or wrongly. But being a global citizen is imperative to us surviving as a society, as a globe, as a planet.
So Steve, to kind of continue on this theme of citizenship, if Chris is thinking about citizenship at kind of this global scale, when you think about working for and with the city of Evanston, you have both U.S. citizens, and then you also have foreign-born residents. So when you think about citizenship, does it kind of come down to the scale of the city? Or do you think about it and does it shape your work at the kind of scale of the nation, of the American citizen?
Well, I mean, I guess I think about it in terms of the city, right? And in terms of getting people more engaged locally. And we have an incredibly engaged electorate in Evanston. It's when Barack Obama ran for the United States Senate, where did he start? Right in Evanston. Because we've got 75,000 people there, 45,000 registered. We had 38,000 vote in the presidential election last November. So this is an incredibly engaged community. It doesn't mean that there isn't division that goes on in that community, division between, some residents and those university students, who just come here for 4 years, or divisions among, all sorts of different categories, I suppose you could say. So my big thing is to look at the opportunities that I have to increase inclusion. Okay, so we talk a lot about, we're a diverse community, and that's true. And you look at all the data, and it would show that. But are we really an inclusive community? And so how do we do that, right? So as mayor, I control, 40, 50 different boards and commissions. I make the appointments to. And so one of the things that I found as I've become the mayor is, some of these people have been on these boards and commissions for an awfully long time. I think we need to move, people out, and we need to be inviting and welcoming to other people. Like, I'm really big into that, not only on everything that's going on at the national level and then how that applies to our community, whether it's DACA or refugees or immigration or all of that. So how do we just get more people engaged? And the interesting thing is, when we do these civic, all these different civic events around town, the folks that come to those aren't the same folks that come to the city council meetings, right? It's good. And honestly, I haven't figured it out, but I think about it a lot. There are other people that are thinking about it. And, I'm also trying to think about, how social media can be used in a more positive way. There are lots of positive things about social media, wonderful things, but it also can be used to divide. So how can it be used to unite? And I don't know if anyone's really figured that out exactly. And I think there's a real opportunity there.
So that's a good segue. Elizabeth, you were talking about the sort of need for and that fundamental definition of face-to-face democracy. So how does social media kind of shape how that works or doesn't work? For all the reasons that Steve mentioned, that it has the possibility to create this sense of community, but it often ends up, we're in our echo chambers, or it's very easy to be very critical of someone on social media because you can't see them kind of wince when you say hateful things.
Yeah, I think, we're now at a tipping point because we have a growing cache of knowledge that social media was used in some pretty nefarious ways during this last election. Regardless of what side of the fence you're on, we know that a basic rule of democratic elections is that if there's a foreign body trying to influence them, they're not being done right. It's not how it's supposed to happen. So now we're waiting to see if not only leadership with respect to kind of whether we can keep bots out of our elections, but also we're waiting to see if we're going to get some leadership on some of these things that you've brought up. And I don't think anybody knows yet how do you break an echo chamber, or how do you turn what is, it's here to stay, right? This new way we communicate, how to turn it into something that generates face-to-face interaction and accountability. Actually, something that Chris said was making me think of what my social media life is like. I was thinking, like, when you were saying we're all global citizens, which is something I really believe. Like, I think you're right, and I think if we don't recognize that healthcare is a problem, like, bodies are bodies, regardless of what country they're in, that this is a problem for everybody, we're kind of in trouble. But that is terrifying to some people, that idea of we're all global citizens. And I know this because, like, sometimes I get bigoted comments on Twitter, and when they come and they're directed toward my identity, they'll often refer to me as a cosmopolitan, right, which is like code for something else, but it took me a while. I caught on eventually. And, like, that's a big slur for them, you know? It didn't feel like a slur to me. I was like, yeah, sure, whatever. But it would be good to recognize that both the kind of, like, boundlessness of the world that we see when we're on social media, but also the boundlessness of the idea that we're all global citizens, that is really a problem for some people, and they're going to need to be included in a way that's not threatening. I don't know what that way is.
Could I, let me be a little more specific when I say there's opportunities out there in social media. So Governor Whitman earlier this morning talked about some research which is true about increasing voter turnout based on knowing information about other people that are in your network. So, oh boy, my neighbor has voted in the last 3 elections, and I haven't. Boy, I better vote. And that research, which is done by academics and everybody else, is shown to be really powerful. And so when you think about social media and think about Facebook, and we talk about the nefarious things that did, go on, Facebook also has that tool, right, where you get the badge that I voted today, and it's the election. Like, those are positive things, I believe, that can be done.
Well, and some people do conduct positive discussions on there, too.
Indeed.
We should not shortchange those people.
Well, you've heard a lot from us, and do we have a mic? Okay, so we have 2 mics, one on both sides. We would love to hear your questions or your thoughts on this question of threats to citizenship, but also how we can overcome them, how we can think about things differently. There's a mic coming a long way. Wait.
I'm sorry. I'm a little wary of identifying identity politics as a challenge rather than a solution. And I think the panel has touched on it a little bit. I guess one of the things that I learned in my Maxwell education is to start every morning with a beginner's mind and to challenge my assumptions. And also my history courses reinforced earlier in the day the discussions that we've had of the importance of knowing the historical context. And the disservice, I think, that has been done by the professor at Columbia, who's my neighbor in a sense in New York, is identity politics has come out of people that have not had an equal chance at the American trowel. And when they've come over, whether they were Russian Jews at the end of the 19th century, when they were African Americans that came against their will. Many people don't forget, but I remember my history course, the first European language spoken on this continent was Spanish. It wasn't English. So what he has deemed as identity politics is very ahistorical, because what we're talking about is people who came to this country, some willingly and some unwillingly, for a slice of the great American dream, and discovered it wasn't a fair playing field. There were structural problems. We could call them racism. We can call them immigrant phobia and so forth. So that leads me to say is I think we do a disservice if we're alluding in any way to the notion that identity politics is a problem rather than an asset.
No, I mean, I think you're exactly right. If we look back over history, identity has been an immensely powerful thing around which to organize for social movements, to make arguments for equality. But it's one of those things that can work in both ways. And so we go back to Tina Nabachi's "It Depends," because on the one hand, it's been the sort of foundation of all of different forms of activism, but we also increasingly see it mobilized in a contemporary moment to sort of make claims for mistreatment for groups for whom the playing field was more level than, say, for immigrant groups that have come in or for racialized groups. So the way it's being used in a contemporary moment, I think, is quite complex. But you're right. No, it certainly has been deeply powerful over many years.
Yeah, I mean, it's not something that's going away, right? And like I said, we all come to the table with an identity, and we need it to be recognized. And we can see, identity will cut both ways when it's not recognized or when it's used against us, when it's manipulated, when it's misunderstood. Then it's a source of problems. It can be a tremendous source of power too. People feel stronger when they come together in an identity group, when they see others like them, when they see that that they can be empowered and gain political stature or social recognition, all of these things. But we can't ignore the fact that identity is being harnessed to do some really damaging things now too. It doesn't have to be that way.
Good afternoon. Sherman Jewett, Executive MPA candidate. Hello. Hi, Chris.
Hoorah.
Hey. We've been here all day, starting with Governor Whitman, and we've been talking about remedies for democracy, how we increase participation, engagement, how we improve our dialogue, and yet every day we we see the press, and there's another transgressive action taken against American democracy. Just one data point has stuck with me, and that's why I internalized this. So in June, the Washington Post did a poll, 1,200 respondents. The Republicans, 52% of Republicans said that they would agree to postponing the 2020 presidential election if the president suggested it. That number rose to 56% if it was the president and Congress. So I guess my question for the panel is, have we been talking about remedies for the common cold, the flu, when our body politic has cancer?
I would like to say a few things. Okay, just a few. But so I'll take your last analogy first, this kind of counterposing of the common cold versus cancer. And I think here we could really use a historian, just because although we're all expressing a lot of anxiety, if you look at specific things that are happening, you can find historical analogs to many of these things. And that's not to say that, if you are deeply troubled by glib tweets, or if you're deeply troubled by what went on during the Democratic primary, that there's something wrong with you for being troubled by that. Those are troubling things. But we've seen them before, and we can look to instances in which we've seen these things in the past to see kind of what we can expect their trajectory to be. We didn't have all the mechanisms for gathering data, like really good polls on whether people would postpone the election. But I think we should want to know why people would be willing to postpone an election. Do they want to postpone the election because they just, want to kind of dismantle the democracy? Do they want to postpone it because they're exhausted and discouraged? Any answer you get to that question will be an answer that has been stated before, but if we understand it, we can kind of look to some of those analogs for some guidance.
I also think, just to your point about the poll and how the numbers rose, if you look at any time the Washington Post or New York Times or anybody's done a poll and they'll say, what's your approval rating for Congress? You know, when they're in the low teens, maybe if they're lucky, but then at the same time they'll say, how's your congressman or congresswoman doing? And their approval rating is always over 50%. And so it's not my guy or my gal, it's everybody else. And so that is part of the cancer. I think the average term for a member of Congress and Senate is somewhere around 18 years. I'm not voting for term limits, but you know, things change, mindsets change, and you need new leadership. There are new things going on, there are new ways to hopefully solve those problems, but the incumbency issue is a huge, huge problem in us trying to fix those problems. So polls are great on the surface, but when you turn the page or peel back a layer of the onion, my guy or my gal's great, it's everybody else that's the problem.
I mean, there are structural issues, right? Gerrymandering, structural issue. Money, potentially money in politics. That everyone that's elected needs, money to get reelected. We've got segmented media today, 24/7, a news station or whatever for any of us to listen to what resonates with us, and the frustration grows, and it grows on both sides. And so we had 59 people, gunned down, slaughtered Sunday night right here in this country for the umpteenth time that it's happened. Polls show the vast majority of people would like to have some sort of change to our laws, gun safety laws, and yet all of these folks that feel that way feel powerless. Well, what can I do? Okay, I want to do something. I can't have all these people die and not do something. Oh, I'm going to call my legislator, my congress member, or my senator. Most people, okay, depending on how they feel about this issue, their congress member feels the same way. And so, okay, well, what's the point of that? Okay, I can go online and social media and say my thoughts and prayers are with all the families and the victims of this terrible mass shooting. I just think the structural issues that we have are in part leading to the frustration that is growing in this country, and that alone is a threat to citizenship.
So I think survey like that, and especially the reporting of them, it's incredibly powerful, right? Those numbers matter, they carry a lot of weight. But one of the challenges is when we think about political views, and I think about this most directly in the context of immigration, it's difficult to kind of get at the complex factor that produced those numbers. And I'll give you an example. So over the years, I've done a lot of research in public schools that have growing immigrant populations, and a lot of interviews with teachers just about how does it change your daily life as a teacher to have your classroom go from being 50% white, 50% African American to 40% Latino in the span of a few years. So how does that change what you do? And in a couple of situations, I didn't ask questions about teachers' personal views on immigration because that wasn't what I was really looking at, but teachers would make statements about being against undocumented immigration. If it were up to me, they wouldn't be here. And then in the next breath, tell me all the links to which they went to support the parents of the immigrant children in their classroom, of meeting after hours and going to their house and doing all of this work with immigrant parents who most likely were undocumented, and the teachers knew that. And so there's often a discrepancy on some of these big issues between what we might report in a survey, or what we might even espouse as our view, and then what our actions are. And that, I think, is where social science can really start to help us think about. I do a lot of research with white working class communities, many of which are publicly sort of touted as the heart of Trump land. And one of the things that we're interested in, my colleague and I, is what is at stake when people in these communities talk about immigration? What is it that's really driving their sense of being left out, of left behind? What's at stake for them when these claims are made? And those are the kinds of dynamics that to me are really important, but they're often hard to get at in those surveys. But at the same time, nobody wants to read a 40-page academic article on the nuances of these processes. And so we're kind of caught between the news cycle and the power of those figures, but then also thinking about what is it that they make visible, but what also do they mask about those dynamics?
Hi, Rich Wilhelm. My question really gets back to the issue of, listen, I understand the idea of there are historical precedents for this, but we all live in the present moment, and I'm reminded of, in a former life, testifying before Congress after a particularly long hearing where every question had been gone over. A particular representative said, "Mr. Wilhelm, I know that every question has been asked, but it hasn't been asked by me yet." And so, what I'd like you to comment on is the, it appears like the checks and balances in our government were designed to work slowly, and they appear to be working, a little bit. But the dialogue, the uncivil dialogue, the demonizing of various groups, the obvious falsehoods that are being told, which, what is this doing to citizenship? What is this doing to the whole? I mean, is this going to change the way our government operates? I mean, it seems to me that's a real threat to our democratic institutions, even in the end game. If is presidential leadership and the idea of presidential leadership being affected? Could you comment on that a little bit more? I mean, we are living in the present moment, and everybody, it's the kind of the elephant in the room. I'd like to hear some comments about what's going on. No matter what your political party is, as an American citizen.
Yeah. I think culture of any organization or people, communities, and there's lots of different communities, right, within the United States, is in part created by the leadership, because we give a lot of power to the President of the United States, or to a state legislator, a state senator, or to a mayor or an alderman. And so I think a lot about your question, Rich. And I did it during the campaign, even though it was an unorthodox approach, that I am never going to say anything about my opponent, right? I am going to be about civility and respect, and this belief that even though we may have different opinions on different issues, we all seek to transmit this city, not only, not less, but greater, better, and more beautiful than it was transmitted to us. I mentioned that a lot during the campaign. I mention that periodically when I feel that people are starting to be very disrespectful of one another. I run a city council meeting practically every Monday, I have people get up there who are very, very heated and who use divisive language. And we have a process in our city where you never engage during public comment. It is the public's opportunity to speak to us. But I will never conduct myself that way. I will always conduct myself with respect and civility, regardless of how nasty someone may be towards, me or other people on the council. And I am trying to lead by example in my community. And I am trying to lead by example of just sharing what my opinion is when people email me or berate me in these emails, and they send it to everybody on the council. And I send them a very respectful email back that oftentimes, may disagree. But you'd be shocked how many people respond back, even though I've disagreed with them. Like, "Dear Mayor, thanks for responding. I thought I'd never hear back from you." But that's part, in my opinion, of, good government, and it's being responsive. A lot of times, people just want to be heard. I've learned that very much over the last 4 months, and there's value in, hearing them and just being respectful back to them. But when we're not, And that's not the way the president operates, okay? The president is ready for a fight every single minute. And I sure don't want a country where we are like that all the time. And so I take the leadership position that I have very, very seriously to try to impart one of civility and respect for everyone in the community.
I'll make one comment because it sounds like you sound like you want to hear something really practical. There are practical things to be said. And I think I'll just make one. It's narrowly tailored, but Citizens United, right? So it's unpopular. Really, nobody likes it. And yet it's possibly one of the biggest influences on not just our elections, but the state we find ourselves in today. And I think we're a successful movement to find a way to undo this with the damage that's been done, or at least to make it impossible going forward. Get less money in politics and more sunlight, I think we'd be in a better place.
You also mentioned the issue of falsehoods, and I think this is a huge challenge that we don't know how it will play out. And again, I'm most familiar with immigration, but if I just think about some of the announcements and the executive orders and the statements about DACA, immigration is always a politically charged issue and it's deeply ideological, but in this moment, we can't just agree about the empirical reality of it, and that's a real challenge when you have policies that are being made on egregiously false claims. And these aren't claims that are debated. These are claims where there's extensive research that debunks, say, the link between immigration and crime or the link between refugees and national security risk. We have quite a bit of research on that. And I don't know what the solution, I mean, we could mandate that they all take classes in the Maxwell School, but aside from that, I think this is a huge challenge of what happens when the people in the positions of power who are making the truths of the country are doing so on sort of false premises. It's a real issue. And calling into question other people's truth claims is just being fake.
And I think, Rich, you talk about being in the moment, and we know that we're 140 characters away from the next moment, unfortunately. And I think the election I mentioned before was a referendum, and it showed people that they could have a voice and get to say and actually have a real movement. And so that was getting people very engaged. I think the backlash of that now is that people are like, oh crap, that's how we got here, and they're not going to be as engaged. And the presidential cycle, I mean, it's only 8 years max. So there's a certain term, I mean, there's a definitive term on what that can be. And during times like this, I think, is when other people like Steve, like my other colleagues up here that are the torchbearers, they carry the baton when that presidential term is over. They're the ones that need to keep everybody else engaged during this 4 years or 8 years, whatever it may be, of, I don't want to say turmoil, but certainly inconsistencies, fake news, whatever it is. And so it's up to everyone, really, to do their part. And we've ridden through waves before. We'll ride through this wave. We're the greatest nation on earth, and we will figure it out. I don't know how or when, but it really is up to everybody here, maybe to pull a little bit harder for those who are afraid to get engaged, for those who don't feel that they're fully represented at the table, to show them that they do have a voice, whether they're here legally or not.
I mean, I would just add another one, right, is at least when I was younger, we had a civics class. And I loved that class. It was one of my favorite classes. And I think if you surveyed, and maybe there's professors here in this room that know this, I don't, but I think if you surveyed schools across America, the number of civics classes that are offered is way down. And yet, we're talking about our country, and we're talking about the future of our country. And is that not worth, teaching civics? So people really understand that this is complex stuff. It's not black and white, okay? There really can be legitimate differences of opinions, but the facts have to be on the table when we're making these decisions.
Good afternoon. My name is Cesar Gray, and thank you, Mr. Haggerty, because that's a perfect segue to what I have to say, or what I have to ask. I'm a political science major at the Maxwell School, and in my Max 123 class, we talk about the importance of education in the context of citizenship, and with the systemic, dysfunctional nature of public schools recently, can the private sector remedy, and can it prepare students in the way that public schools can to participate in citizenship, to participate in democracy? Can private schools prepare better citizens than public schools? And this speaks to a bigger question of, can the private sector mold good citizens? And should it? Is the private sector also responsible for what the public has to say and what the public is doing?
Maybe I'll go first as the private sector guy. Citizenship isn't taught in the public or private sector. It's taught at home. Steve talked about his upbringing. I was raised by a single mom, special education teacher, and it's really what you're grown up with. It's up to us. I mentioned a few minutes ago, we have to carry that baton. We have to carry that torch for the next generation, 3 generations, whatever it is. It's not up to a specific industry or a sector of the government or of the country. It's up to you. It's up to me. It's up to all of us to do it. Everyone does their part to try and promote citizenship. In the private sector, there are different things where they promote diversity, they promote veterans, they promote breast cancer, whatever the topic of the month is, and they do that, and they go out of their way to do it, and they also do it to get street cred. Look at how much I'm spending on being socially responsible this year. Come work for us, and so let's take all the kids out of Maxwell and Wharton and everywhere else. So do they have a vested interest? Sure, but that's what the private sector does. So I don't think there's any one side that can do it. It's up to individual values and beliefs to do it.
I want to get at the very specific question you asked. Can the private sector prepare students as well as the public sector? Because there's a really concrete question in there which has to do with devolving responsibility for the education of children to the private sector. And I'm speaking as a layperson now, not as an expert, because I'm not an expert on private or charter schools, but from what I've read as a layperson, a layperson with a strong interest in receiving students who have had a good high school education, it makes my week when everybody, looks like they did what they were supposed to be doing. There have been some stumbles in the private sphere, there were high hopes for some of the charter school programs that weren't realized, and some of the people who were supporting them had said it didn't work out the way we wanted it to. So I don't think we've seen what proponents had hoped out of charter school education. Doesn't mean it's not possible, but I'm not at a point where I'm willing to kind of go all in because of some of those stumbles. There's another issue too, which is when we think about education as a public responsibility and as something we're all doing together, we're all invested, right? And now we don't tend to think that way in the United States, in part because our schools are districted and, the kind of education you get in the public education system very much depends on what kind of house your parents can afford to buy. But if we were thinking about this as a truly public responsibility, we might be in a different place.
Hi, Dustin Brown. One of the things that I talk a lot about with my international colleagues who have, as a general rule, certainly in parliamentary systems, governments that are designed to work, is that nobody comes to the U.S. to study our form of government, which obviously was designed, in the basic kind of way not to work, right, with lots of checks and balances that don't exactly exist. And one of the things that, especially recently really seems to be more prominent is a lot of the things that allowed the systems of government to continue to function are eroding. And I mean even things like earmarks, right? That used to kind of allow people to vote for things that they may not like, but they had something in it, and that's gone. People, once elected to be a member of Congress, moved their whole families to Washington, D.C. They got to know each other socially, versus now you fly in Tuesday morning, you fly out Thursday afternoon, you never actually interact with other people of maybe a different party. Socially, you don't see them on the soccer field like we understand used to happen a little more often. Gerrymandering obviously has been brought up. Campaign financing has been brought up. 24/7 news cycle obviously is a major factor here as well. And then even an additional one of the Hastert rule, which I haven't heard as much about, but the idea that you only bring up pieces of legislation that can be passed with just the majority party's vote, which is making the idea of compromise seen as a complete negative versus a positive. And you hear people like Trent Lott and others kind of talk about the need to get back to that. John McCain most recently, obviously. So anyway, that's just my list that I kind of jotted down in terms of things that are really eating away and driving kind of our normal kind of functioning that had historically worked despite some of the things designed in our Constitution to prevent progress from being made that are real risks. And I'd be interested if people have done that sort of real analysis of the root causes of some of this and which possibilities we have that are most immediate or longer term to overcome them.
I haven't done any research on this, but as a professor, that won't stop me from giving an answer. Just in listening to you talk, I was struck by the things that you are describing are in some ways, it's a process we're seeing in a lot of places, which is kind of the disinvestment in the social fabric, right? So it used to be that elected officials were in DC and they worked out together and they played soccer together and they ran into each other in the hallways. And there was sort of face-to-face interaction. Even if there were political disagreements or ideological disagreements, there was a social in some way that was being produced through those actions. And their staff. So there was a social fabric, social dynamic that was being produced that we're just not seeing now. And again, this isn't based on any research, but if we think about the impacts of that disinvestment in the social and other contexts, sometimes it's that polarization you're thinking about. So maybe one of the factors you're seeing is the changing practice of what it means to be an elected official, just sort of the day in, day out, is reshaping kind of how political dynamics play out. Does that hold any water, Elizabeth, our resident political scientist? She says no.
Yeah, I think you're not wrong to point out. I mean, if I understand correctly, the theme that draws together the comments that you made is that we seem to be actively seeking out ways not to compromise, right? In some ways we're using procedures in Congress to make compromise less likely. And I don't think that I think you have to look to, how we run our parties. I'm not even a parties expert. I don't know why I keep bringing up parties, but I think you have to look at what advantages there are for political parties, for incumbents, and try and root out some of the incentives there are, or disincentives to compromise before you're going to be able to overcome that barrier. Just to your first comment, our system was designed not to work. I don't think it was designed not to work. I think it was designed not to be directly democratic, fully democratic. It was designed to have some real kind of brakes on certain types of democracy. But I think the founders were deeply concerned about whether it would work and really wanted it to work and wanted the very thing you're describing, which is compromise between, at that point, factions that could have broken the republic apart.
So my first 4 months as mayor has been a fascinating experience, unlike anything else I've ever done before. And one of the structural barriers that became evident to me within the first 2 weeks is that I could never actually have a level of collegiality with the other elected officials, because if we got together just on a casual basis to have a beer, okay, and just to talk about the community, we couldn't, because we would be in violation of the Open Meetings Act. And the Open Meetings Act in Illinois says that if you have a 9-person council, which we have a 9-person city council, no more than 2 members can get together at any time. And if the mayor's involved, then there could be 2 members and I, okay? So think about that for a second. We are so concerned about the nefarious things that these elected officials that we have elected to hopefully, move us forward as a community could do. We have set a law. And by the way, that law wasn't set by the local people. That law was set by the state legislators. And by the way, that law doesn't apply to the state legislators. It only applies to you at the local level. Well, let me tell you, this is a barrier to getting work done, because how can we have a sense of purpose and collegiality when, if there are more than three of them together, city council members together, somebody's reporting it as a violation to the Attorney General's office? Oh my gosh, I just saw Paul, Mary, and Bob together. They must be talking about city business. I mean, it's bad. It's bad to the point where at one of the city council meetings, someone got up and said, you guys are in violation of the Open Meetings Act, because when we're between meetings, they start off with committee meetings and it leads up to the city council meeting. There's an aldermanic library. That is where food is served for us. You can go get a sandwich or whatever, and we sit there at a table. Because you guys are in there, you must be conducting city business. I can tell you, I've been there for 4 months. Nobody's in there conducting city business. They're tired, and they're getting a bite to eat before they go back out to the next committee meeting or city council meeting. But this feeling of distrust that exists out there in communities and across the country towards our government is a real detriment. And I read a very disturbing article by a United States Congress member who said, I really can't be seen with somebody from the other party because I'm almost viewed as a traitor. Like, what? How are we ever going to move forward if that's the case?
So I want to thank all of you for coming out. Can we give our panelists a round of applause? And I want to give a shout. Oh, I think he's left. I want to give a shout out to our awesome undergrad from 123 who had a fabulous question that I'm still thinking about public versus private schools. So thank you for coming, and we appreciate your questions.